This is very exciting. Joining me today on Salon Talks is a face and a man who's familiar to anybody who has watched press coverage of the Trump White House over the last 2 years. CNN's chief White House correspondent, Jim Acosta. Welcome, Jim.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And Jim, you are the author of a new book, which I understand is just qualified as a bestseller, called The Enemy of the People. I guess that phrase was inevitable. So congratulations on the book. And I want to start with an issue that you raise very clearly in the book, which is the way that you've come to play a role in the story of covering the Trump White House. And you address this very directly. And from people in our profession, I've heard every opinion ranging from it's awesome, Jim Acosta is a hero, he's speaking truth to power, to why is this asshole trying to put himself in front of the cameras and become the star of the story. So tell us how you kind of manage that and how you thought about that.
Well, I appreciate the question. I mean, I would say that, listen, it is sometimes difficult to stay in your lane as a reporter when you're getting run off the road by the White House and by the president. And we have seen that go on over the last few years. I mean, I will say that I was raised in this business to not make myself part of the story. That's how I was brought up in this industry, whether it was in local news in places like Knoxville, Tennessee, or Dallas, or Chicago, or at the network level at CBS News or at CNN. It's important to me. But, I'll take you back to January of 2017 when we had that press conference where the president called me fake news. It was at that press conference where he was attacking our news organization, saying that a story that we had covered about the U.S. intelligence community going to the president-elect and saying, Mr. President, there may be a problem here. The Russians may have compromising information on you. The president-elect at that point called that fake news. He said a real story was fake news. He was intentionally telling the public that up was down and black was white. And so, yes, at that point, I pushed back. I interrupted the press conference. I tried to get my question in. And, that's when you saw Donald Trump refer to me and my news organization as fake news. Now, that really hasn't stopped ever since then. And as I write in the book, what I think started off as an act has gotten out of his control. And at that press conference in February of 2017, when he called me very fake news, as I write in the book, right after the press conference, Hope Hicks, one of his top aides, called me to say, Jim, the president thought you were very professional today, and said, Jim gets it. And, this I think was an act in the beginning, but the president has proceeded to go on to call us the enemy of the people so many times now that it doesn't even register as a blip on our radar screens anymore. And so, yes, I've tried to push back when it's been necessary. But I think if you look at the body of work, if you look at the record of what I've done over the last few years, that hasn't been every time I've gone out in front of the cameras, every time I've picked up a microphone. But certainly opinions are going to vary. But if I had to do what I've done all over again, I would essentially do it the same way.
Thanks for that. That's very helpful. In terms of, you may have just answered this question, but in terms of how much Trump's attitude toward the press is a shtick or an act designed to fire up his supporters who have, let's say, a built-in prejudice about what they regard as the overly liberal media, and how much does it reflect a genuine conviction on his part that in some way he's not being treated fairly? How do you see that question?
Well, I think, what started off as, a way to taunt and troll us, and as I write in the book, Steve Bannon says, he and the president essentially together came up with this idea to start calling us the enemy of the people. Obviously, the expression has been around much longer, and people like Stalin use that expression to demonize their opponents. But this was something done at the very beginning of this administration as a way to pull the press into this combative environment that he thrives on. And it is an environment that he uses to excite his base. As I heard from one senior White House official as I was writing this book, the expression, the enemy of the people, when it's applied to the press, is not meant to incite the people, it's meant to incite the media. And so they want us drawn in. So we have this discussion on Twitter and social media and so on. But here's the problem, and this is where I hope folks will focus in on as they read this book. Not everybody is in on the act, and the president has demonized us in ways and put rhetoric out there that I think has inflamed the political environment in this country to the point where folks absorb this hostility, they absorb this rhetoric, and they direct it back at us in ways that make us feel endangered. And I'm not just talking about myself. Yes, I've received death threats. Yes, I've seen threatening messages come into my social media on a regular basis, but there are other journalists out there, other reporters, other news anchors who cover this president who've been going through the same thing. And as I've been telling folks, I've covered 4 different presidential campaigns. This is my second administration. I've never seen anything at this level before, and we have to think deeply about whether or not this is the kind of political climate we want in this country.
Well, you mentioned this in the book. A potential mail bomb was sent to your organization and to a number of other news organizations, as we remember. And fairly recently at Trump's re-election rally in Orlando, a news photographer got ambushed and punched in the face by somebody. There have been a bunch of minor incidents like that. Like, at what point is going to cross over into somebody actually inflicting actual lethal violence on some journalist, some photographer, some television cameraman, and is the profession prepared for that?
I mean, I think that is the danger. And here's what happens. The day that somebody is seriously injured or, God forbid, killed, the United States of America is no longer the place you and I grew up in anymore. At that point, this country crosses over into a new territory where we join a list of countries around the world where the press is not really safe doing its job covering the presidency. And the question that I raise in this book, and I try to raise when I talk to folks about this, is this the kind of climate that we want to pass on to the next generation? And I think more of a pressing question and a pressing concern in our immediate future right now is, where does it go from here? How do things escalate from here? If it's okay for the president, if it's generally acceptable to everybody for the president to refer to the press as the enemy of the people or any segment of American society, where does it go after that? How do things escalate from that standpoint? And my sense of it is that we don't want to go down this road. People don't want to go down this road. And I think I'm well within my lane as a straight news reporter to raise these questions. This has been happening to me. And so I feel as though I'm in a good position to talk about it. But my sense of it is we don't want to go down this road because, my goodness, what happens to this country if on the next morning after a campaign rally, we're talking about somebody who has been seriously hurt or killed. And what started off for the president as taunting and trolling and having a good time on social media and firing up people over at Fox News, I don't think he fully understands the ramifications of what he's dealing with at this point. And that's part of the reason why I wrote this book, to sort of fire off a flare into the sky, throw up a caution flag to say this is not the road we want to go down.
Now, this is exactly Donald Trump's MO, though, isn't it? I mean, he's now made a couple of remarks about possibly, needing to stay on longer than 8 years or something. And he can dismiss those as jokes. They probably are consciously intended as jokes, but he does not appear to understand that represents a fundamental threat to the entire nature of our republic and the way that it's governed, right?
That's right. And we've gone from, the president referring to fake news to now fake polls. What's next? Fake election results.
Right.
That is destabilizing to any democracy. And, what I say to folks is that there's no guarantee that the American experience that we've all grown accustomed to over the last generation continues to exist as it stands right now. And, Michael Cohen, during his hearing up on Capitol Hill, famously said he's not sure whether or not Donald Trump will give up the presidency if he loses. And as I write in my book, I consulted with a handful of presidential scholars and historians. One of them, Larry Sabato from the University of Virginia, not exactly a raging progressive, says to me in my book, and I put it in there because I thought it was so important, that he has never contemplated a scenario where a president would try to attempt a coup to stay in power since Nixon until Donald Trump came along. And, Larry Sabato is not somebody who goes off and makes those kinds of statements. So it's not just folks in the press. It's not just folks on the left or maybe left of center. There are people right of center, as we know, and there are people in academia who are deeply concerned about the rhetoric and whether it's just going to take things too far. And, I'm not here to say vote for this person or vote for that person. I am here saying that we need to think about this rhetoric and whether or not it's healthy for our democracy.
When you look back at the 2016 election, which you had a very up-close look at, there is this perception out there that, in particular, mainstream media organizations such as yours, such as the New York Times, such as the Washington Post, such as the other news networks, played a role in the way that they covered Trump and the way that they covered Hillary Clinton, and in
Yeah.
in shaping both an overconfidence that Trump couldn't possibly be elected, and also a sort of narrative of moral or ethical equivalence between two candidates, like them or don't like them, where the equation was actually extremely different. How do you evaluate that looking back?
Well, I think you raised some very good points, and this was obviously, an issue. During the aftermath of the 2016 campaign, people were asking the question whether we gave too much coverage to Donald Trump. I'll say a couple of things about that. One is, obviously, Donald Trump was the front runner through most of the GOP primary process. And so what I say to folks when they ask me this question, because it gets asked from time to time, is, are we not supposed to cover the Republican front runner, during the campaign? So I think to some extent we had to. Now, I do think moving forward, you're going to see less of those rallies covered end to end. That is something that we saw a whole lot of during the 2016 campaign. And I think there's a recognition, not just on our part at CNN, but across the industry, that, when you have a president who's been in office for 2 years and he's been found to have uttered approximately 10,000 false or misleading statements since he's been in office, that perhaps airing these rallies end to end is not going to be a good thing in terms of getting reliable, accurate information to the American people. And so I think that's part of the reason why heading into the 2020 campaign, you're going to see fewer rallies covered end to end. And I think you're going to see more coverage after the rallies are over with fact checkers. Just recently, we hired Daniel Dale from the Toronto Star,
Yes.
a terrific reporter who I think understands Trump's falsehoods better than Trump himself. And you're going to see, I think, more of that kind of coverage heading into 2020. And, to some extent, I think, yes, we are learning some lessons from the previous campaign, but I think that happens with every campaign cycle. And having said all of that, one thing I would invite folks to do is also consider that there were other news outlets, New York Times, Washington Post, major newspapers, who were also devoting a lot of coverage to Donald Trump. It was a fascinating story in 2016, and I think, the press had to cover it as such. Now, as for Hillary Clinton, one thing I will say about Hillary Clinton is, the folks in the press did not tell Hillary Clinton not to campaign in Wisconsin. And I remember covering the 2016 campaign, covering Donald Trump and going to all of his rallies. We get back to our hotel at 11 or 12 o'clock at night. I touched base with my friends who covered the Hillary Clinton campaign, and they would say, oh, we've been at the Ritz-Carlton in White Plains since 7 o'clock this evening. So they were just running that campaign with a different pace and energy. And, I'm not calling into question what they did during that campaign, but I mean, folks can go back and look at the schedules. Donald Trump was campaigning around the clock for the presidency towards the end of that campaign. And that's how I remember it.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think the complacency of the Clinton campaign definitely played a role there. I want to ask you about your perception of the question of how different Donald Trump really is, because obviously you make a strong case in your book that this White House has represented an enormous change in the way it deals with the press and the way it deals with information, in the way it understands facts and the way it understands truth. At the same time, aren't we talking about a gradual evolution in American politics where you talk about the Tea Party movement, which in many ways represented some of the beginnings of this and was had plenty of attacks on the media and was to some extent a racist movement concealed as something else. We have a Republican Senate that refused to consider a legitimate Supreme Court nominee for political reasons. We had an administration 2 administrations ago that had secret torture sites in places in the world that we never really even found out about. Even the Obama administration considered prosecuting Jim Risen, the former Times reporter, for his contacts with whistleblowers. They ultimately didn't do it. But with Trump, are we seeing a radical shift, or is it a symptom of something that's been going on for a long time?
It's a good question. I will say that, and I've heard many of these comparisons before, and I do remind folks from time to time, listen, if you think times are tough now, we did have this thing in the mid-2000s where, a war was waged over weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist. We do go through periods of turmoil in our nation's history, and one of the remarkable things about the United States is that we seem to keep making our way through those periods. And that's a testament to the kind of country that that was here before Donald Trump came along. Having said all of that, I will say, though, yes, Barack Obama had his clashes with the press. I witnessed those firsthand, covering the second term of his administration. But at the same time, we did not have Barack Obama on almost a weekly basis referring to the press as the enemy of the people and accusing reporters of treason and calling legitimate stories fake news. There's sort of an Alice in Wonderland through the looking glass quality to the way this president regards facts and truth. And one of the things that I ask folks from time to time is, my goodness, what kind of world would we be living in right now? What would be our sense of the truth and reality if we hadn't been fact-checking the president over the last 2 years? He's turned all of us into fact-checkers in real time. We're almost fact-checking on the fly while we're doing live shots on CNN these days, because you'll be doing a live shot, the producer will get in your ear and say, a tweet just came in. And my attitude is hold on a second. I want to look at this tweet. I want to read this tweet. I want to make sure it's factually accurate before I read it on the air, because as we've seen so many times with the president's Twitter feed, and I take no joy in saying this, his Twitter feed is sometimes, a fact disaster. It's a fact catastrophe and a truth emergency. And I think that, that has made us sharper as reporters, and it's put us in a position where maybe, we're calling a president out. Not maybe, we are calling a president out for falsehoods and lies much more so than we used to with other previous presidents, Republican and Democrat. But I can't think of a scenario where we just let all of these falsehoods hang out there as the truth and reality. I think our sense of reality would be warped by this point had we not been providing that essential function over the last 2 years. I just can't imagine a world where we had done anything different in that regard.
You make very clear in your book that you've had sources within the Trump administration, within the Republican Party on Capitol Hill, among previous Republican administrations, perhaps among the never Trumper contingent, who've talked about their level of discomfort with this president. But you also talk about the fact that the Republican Party in general has pretty much capitulated and gone along with him. And now we see, former Vice President Biden running a presidential campaign on the basis that some degree of normalcy can be restored to the Republican Party once Trump leaves the scene. I'm not asking you to reveal sources or to endorse or unendorse Vice President Biden, but how do you evaluate the idea that the Republicans can get all better again once Trump is gone?
Well, I think it's something of an existential crisis for the Republican Party right now. I think they're going to have to decide at some point, just what to do about this president. As I write in the book, they've been realizing these short-term political gains, whether they be tax cuts or conservative judges and so on. And, they've had to stomach and deal with a whole lot of things that many of them consider to be reprehensible. As I write in the book, they clashed with the president openly, and it was one of the brief things where they disagreed publicly over whether or not Trump should endorse and support Roy Moore. He did it anyway. And I talked to, some Republicans who I guess you would call never Trumpers, but I talked to a lot of Republicans who work up on Capitol Hill, who maybe wouldn't work for this president, but certainly work for people who have worked with this president, who were putting, it was like a facepalm moment after moment after moment on so many of these different occasions, where they would say to me, on background, anonymously, my goodness, what is going on with him and Vladimir Putin? Or my goodness, what is happening with Charlottesville? And so on. And they just, as a party, haven't gotten to a point where they're comfortable really taking him on publicly. And I wonder, what will be that scenario when they ultimately do that? My sense is that it's something that will come eventually. In politics, you just can't outrun some of these things. And yes, we saw this during the 2016 campaign. We said, there's no way you could say I can shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and get away with it, or say that John McCain is not a war hero and get away with it. And he has survived all of these what would be political crises for any other politician. But I do think I'm glad you picked up on that part of the book, because it's one of the parts of the book that I turn back to myself, because I don't take any joy in talking about the Republican Party that way. One of my best friends is a Republican, but when you talk to folks privately, they pass along concerns that they won't talk about publicly. And my sense of it is that dynamic is not going to be able to stay private for very long. Those feelings are not going to be able to stay private forever. At some point, they're going to say something about it. I was surprised in this book that Kellyanne Conway, during a one-on-one interview, said that she wasn't comfortable with the family separation policy down at the border. Said that publicly on the record. And my question is, well, how are you still working for this president then?
Yeah.
And so they have, as I write in the book, they have compromised. They didn't compromise with Democrats, but they've compromised quite a bit with themselves. And it's one of the more fascinating storylines of this presidency, I would say.
One word answer, which was worse, Charlottesville or Helsinki?
Wow. Goodness. I still come back to Charlottesville as just one of the defining moments of this presidency. Helsinki was rough, and it was almost universally regarded as such. Even the president had to correct the record after Helsinki was over. But Charlottesville is one of those things that I just thought I would never see on American soil in my lifetime. Nazis and white supremacists on the march, and a major, I guess it's not a major American city, but a city that is important to this country and its history,
sure.
The home of Thomas Jefferson. And to see, and I don't, like I said earlier, I don't take any joy in any of this, but the President of the United States equivocated over white supremacist violence in that city. And it's something that I write about in the book. It is one of those moments where I think we're going to look back 5, 10, 15 years from now, and we're going to say, my goodness, that was a failure. That was a failure that just let everybody down across the country. And you'll notice that the president, his people they get very fired up about this. They don't like it when we call them out on that, but I just don't see how you can describe it as anything but equivocating on white supremacist violence, and continue to present yourself as somebody who is dealing with the truth and the facts. I think that is undoubtedly what we saw take place over those 4 or 5 days after what happened in Charlottesville. And it's just going to be something that will always stay with me because I was covering the president so closely during that time. I never thought I would see a president behave in that manner, and I guess that's why it's such an important part of my book.
Jim Acosta, CNN's White House correspondent and author of the new best-selling book, The Enemy of the People. Thank you so much, Jim.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it. Good talking to you.